The Galactic Council of Sovereign Worlds had been in session for 211 years, and in all that time, not a single vote had gone against the Vethra Empire. That was not an accident. Delegate Oren Sable understood this as clearly as he understood anything about the political machinery he had spent 6 years studying from the outside. He had read every public transcript of every council session going back to the founding charter. He had cross-referenced voting records, traced diplomatic communication timelines, and mapped the economic dependency chains that bound the smaller member worlds to the Empire's trade corridors. The picture that emerged was not one of corruption in the crude sense. There were no envelopes of credits passing under conference tables. There was nothing so clumsy as that. What the Vethra had built was something far more durable, a system of structured inevitability. Oren stood in the transit bay of the orbital station designated Conclave 7, watching the approach vectors of 11 different diplomatic vessels through a viewport that needed cleaning. The station orbited a dim red dwarf that no one had bothered to name, chosen specifically because it was equidistant from the 7 primary political blocks of the known galaxy. That neutrality was, of course, cosmetic. He had proven that to his own satisfaction years ago. Ambassador Sable. His aide, a young woman named Petra Hess, appeared at his elbow with the practiced quiet of someone who had learned not to startle him. The Vethra delegation has already arrived. 3rd tier, private berths. They came in 6 hours early. Of course they did, Oren said. Petra held out a data tablet with the session agenda. Opening plenary is in 4 hours. The vote on the resource allocation treaty is scheduled for the 2nd day, but there's already pressure from the Cathali and Duranian delegations to move it forward. Word is the Empire wants it settled before the independent bloc representatives finish their internal caucuses. Oren took the tablet and scrolled through the agenda without really reading it. He already knew what it said. He also knew what it did not say, which was considerably more important. How many of the independent bloc delegates have met with Vethra representatives since arriving? He asked. We've confirmed 4. Probably more that we haven't confirmed. And the Mira Compact? Their new delegate? Petra hesitated. That hesitation told him something. She met with them first. Before she even checked into her quarters. Oren handed the tablet back. He picked up his bag from the bench beside him and started walking toward the delegate processing corridor. His credentials identified him as the first representative of Earth, a planet that most of the galaxy's political establishment considered a curiosity at best and an irrelevance at worst. Humanity had been a council member for only 9 years. Earth contributed a modest trade surplus, no military capacity worth calculating, and a single delegate to the floor. What they also contributed, though no one had yet realized it, was him. He had not come to the Conclave 7 session to make a speech. He had not come to argue treaty language or trade-weighted vote mechanisms or propose amendments to the resource allocation framework. Those were the terms on which the Vethra controlled every conversation that happened inside these walls. They had spent 2 centuries making sure that every substantive debate happened on ground they had already prepared, using tools they had already shaped. Oren intended to bring something else entirely. His bag contained a single physical data core, encrypted, with a chain of custody log going back 14 months. The information on it had taken him 4 years to assemble, 2 years to verify, and 8 months to legally and independently authenticate through institutions that had no relationship to any Vethra-adjacent funding source. He had been meticulous about that last part. Meticulousness was the point. The processing corridor was a long, low-lit passage designed to feel more like a diplomatic anteroom than a security checkpoint, which it was. He passed through the biometric scans and the credential readers with the mild, unconcerned expression of someone who had nothing to hide. He smiled at the Vethra security observer stationed near the exit arch. The observer did not smile back. That was fine. Inside the main concourse, the diplomatic ecosystem of a galaxy's worth of political ambition was already in motion. He could see the color-coded faction badges from 20 meters away. The Cathali delegation moved in a close group, their body language tight and defensive, which was unusual for them. The Dorinians were already in a side conversation with someone he did not recognize. The Mira Compact delegate, a tall woman in formal gray, stood near the central information display, speaking to no one, which meant she was listening to everyone. And the Vethra were everywhere, in the way that furniture is everywhere. You stopped noticing it until you needed to move through the room. Orin found his assigned delegation suite on the 4th level and closed the door behind him. The room was modest by council standards, which meant it was still far better equipped than anything at the diplomatic facility back in Geneva. He set his bag on the desk and did not open it. He sat down in the chair by the viewport and looked out at the red dwarf and thought for a long time about what he was going to do tomorrow, and the day after, and what would happen after that. He was not afraid, exactly. Fear was a luxury for people who had not yet done the arithmetic. Orin had done it 3 times, using different methodologies, and the conclusions kept coming out the same. The Vethra had controlled the council's voting outcomes for 200 years because they had controlled the conditions under which votes were taken. The dependent worlds voted the way they voted because they had no realistic alternative. The independent bloc abstained or supported whichever position caused them less immediate economic discomfort. And the council's institutional structure, built by people who had trusted the Vethra's founding generosity, had never developed the mechanisms to check what the empire had gradually become. None of that was illegal, by the council's own charter. What Orin had found, after 4 years of careful work, was something that was not a technicality. Not a procedural loophole that could be dismissed in a committee session. Something real, documented, independently verified, and structurally impossible to misinterpret if you were paying attention, which no one in this building had been paid to do. He opened his bag and looked at the data core for a moment, then closed the bag again. Tomorrow, the session would open with the usual formalities. Credentials would be reaffirmed. The agenda would be approved. The small theatrics of interstellar diplomacy would proceed exactly as they always had. The Vethra delegation would be gracious and efficient and entirely in command of every variable in the room. And Orin Sable, first representative of a planet that most of the galaxy had not yet bothered to take seriously, would sit in his assigned seat in the observer tier and watch, and wait, and take notes. He had one shot at this. He had always known that. He intended to make it count. The first morning session opened with the recitation of a chord, a 5-minute ceremonial reading of the council's founding principles that everyone in the chamber had long since stopped hearing as anything other than background sound. Orin heard every word. The chamber itself was a marvel of deliberate design, and he had studied its architecture the way a chess player studies a board. The seating arrangement encoded the council's power relationships as precisely as any treaty text. The 7 primary bloc delegations occupied the main floor in concentric semicircles, with the Vethra Empire at the center position, elevated by exactly 12 centimeters above the surrounding rows. The elevation was not specified in any architectural document he had been able to access. It was simply a fact of the room, visible only once you had thought to measure it. Observer delegations occupied the upper tier. Earth was in that tier. The 9-year rule for full floor access was not a rule anywhere in the charter. It was a precedent, established in a procedural vote taken in the Council's 30th year, when the Vethra had supported it in the context of managing a rapid expansion period. Every subsequent expansion had applied the same standard because the Charter allowed it, and because no one had yet had a reason to challenge it. Orin had identified 14 such precedents. 14 instances where something that functioned as a structural rule was actually just a decision that had never been revisited. He sat in the observer tier and watched the morning proceed. The agenda approval went efficiently. The preliminary debate on the Resource Allocation Treaties framework was opened by the Cathali lead delegate, a veteran named Prosecutor Emeritus Varek Own, who was careful and thorough and ultimately persuasive about nothing in particular. The Dorinian response was collegial and empty. The Vethra representative, Senior Delegate Sesson Lear, spoke for 11 minutes and managed to seem helpful while confirming nothing and committing to less. From the observer tier, it looked like governance. Orin had read enough transcripts to understand that this was what governance looked like when its outcomes were already determined. During the midday recess, he walked the concourse at a pace that suggested someone with nowhere to be. He stopped at the refreshment stations, at the public information displays, at the informal seating clusters where delegations traditionally held the conversations that actually shaped the sessions. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, he introduced himself as a junior analyst from Earth's delegation office, which was technically true. He learned 3 things during that recess that confirmed what he had already suspected. The Mira Compact delegation had been offered a renegotiation of their primary trade corridor access rights in exchange for their support on the resource allocation vote. The offer had come through an intermediary, someone who appeared in no official delegation roster, which was either an oversight or a design feature. The offer was substantial enough that the Mira Compact delegate, despite her evident discomfort, was almost certainly going to accept it. The Cathali were aware of something they were not saying. Their body language in the informal recess conversations was different from their body language on the floor. On the floor, they performed the expected skepticism. Off the floor, they were quiet in a way that suggested they had already made a private calculation. And the Dorinians had requested a closed meeting with the Vethra delegation for that evening, which was unprecedented in a session context, because closed bilateral meetings during open sessions were technically prohibited by the session protocol. Not by the charter. By the session protocol, which was set by the session chair, who was appointed by a rotating committee, whose rotation schedule was administered by the Vethra Secretariat. None of this was smoking gun evidence of anything. It was the texture of a system doing what it had been built to do. He returned to his seat in the observer tier for the afternoon session, which covered 3 supplementary agenda items of no particular consequence. He took notes. He was the only person in the observer tier still taking notes by hand, on actual paper, which had attracted exactly 1 comment from a Vethra administrative aide who had passed his row that morning and looked at him with something between amusement and mild curiosity. He had smiled and said nothing. What he was doing with the paper notes was building a timeline. Not of the session, but of the chamber. Specifically, of when certain people were in certain positions relative to the floor's open microphone system. The system was standard council technology, designed to allow any floor delegate to request speaking time through the session chair. It was not designed to be accessed from the observer tier. That was another precedent, not a rule. Oren had found the relevant charter language 6 months ago. Article 17, subsection 9, paragraph 4 of the founding charter stated, in language that had clearly been written by committee, that any credentialed member world representative who could demonstrate direct relevance to a pending vote question could petition the session chair for emergency speaking status, regardless of their current tier classification, if the petition was accompanied by independently verified documentary evidence of a material fact unknown to the chamber. He had read that language perhaps 200 times. He had had it reviewed by 3 separate legal scholars, none of whom had any connection to each other or to any Vethra-aligned institution. All 3 had reached the same conclusion: the provision was valid, it was enforceable, and it had never been used because no one had ever needed it badly enough to try. The afternoon session closed at the standard time. The chamber filed out with the polite efficiency of people who knew where they were going next. Senior Delegate Lear of the Vethra departed with his customary unhurried composure, trailing 2 aides and a security consultant whose role in the delegation was not specified in any public document. Oren stayed in his seat for a few minutes after the chamber had mostly emptied. He looked at the floor layout, the center position, the 12 centimeters of elevation. He thought about the data core in his bag. He thought about Article 17, subsection 9, paragraph 4. He thought about 4 years of work and 2 years of verification and 8 months of independent authentication, and about a chain of custody log that could survive any scrutiny the Vethra's legal team could bring to bear, because he had specifically designed it to. Then he stood up, gathered his notes, and walked back to his room to prepare for tomorrow. What Oren had found, at the core of everything, was a document. Not a dramatic document. Not a secret manifesto or a recording of some private conspiracy. It was, on its face, a resource survey. A detailed, technically precise, 300-page geological and atmospheric assessment of a system called the Varek Reach, conducted by a contracted survey organization called Helix Meridian Analytics, dated 53 years ago. The survey had been commissioned by the Vethra Empire's Colonial Development Office. It had never been submitted to the Galactic Council, despite the fact that the Varek Reach system sat inside a boundary zone that, under Article 41 of the Council Charter, required full resource disclosure to the collective membership before any development rights could be granted. The survey had not been hidden, exactly. It existed in the Colonial Development Office's public archive, accessible to anyone with the appropriate research credentials and the patience to navigate a filing system that appeared to have been organized by someone who actively disliked clarity. It was catalogued under a subsection reference that corresponded to no standard classification scheme, in a subfolder whose parent directory was labeled, in Vethran administrative shorthand, as completed historical reviews, inactive. It had been sitting there for 53 years. The reason this mattered, and the reason Oren had spent 4 years confirming that it mattered, was the content of the survey itself. The Varek Reach was not, as the Vethra had represented to the Council in 6 separate sessions over the past 4 decades, a low-yield periphery system with marginal development potential. The survey showed something else entirely. The Varek Reach contained, distributed across its 3rd and 4th planetary bodies, one of the largest confirmed deposits of stellite or ever documented. Stellite was the material on which approximately 40% of faster-than-light drive technology depended. Its distribution across the known galaxy was limited and had been declining for 30 years, which was why the resource allocation treaty that the Council was currently preparing to ratify had become so important. The treaty redistributed access rights to the known stellite-bearing systems according to a formula that had been developed, almost entirely, by Vethra technical advisors. Under the treaty as currently written, the Varek Reach was classified as an unallocated boundary zone, outside the treaty's scope, available for development by any party with proximity rights, which meant, in practice, the Vethra. If the survey had been disclosed to the Council 53 years ago, as required by Article 41, the Varek Reach would have been included in the resource accounting that underpinned the entire treaty framework. Every negotiating position, every trade-off, every compromise that had shaped the treaty over the past 11 years of negotiations, would have been different. The dependent worlds, whose treaty allocations were based on their assessed needs relative to total known reserves, would have received substantially more. The Mira Compact's trade corridor offer would have been unnecessary, because they would have held a stronger hand from the beginning. The treaty, as written, was built on a 40% undercount of the resource base it was designed to govern. That was the fact. That was the material fact that had never been disclosed to the chamber. He had verified the survey's authenticity through 3 independent geological assessment firms, none of them Earth-based. He had confirmed its classification and discovery date through the archive's own metadata, which could not be retroactively altered without leaving a detectable record. He had had the Article 41 disclosure requirement reviewed by legal scholars in 4 different council member worlds. He had documented his own research process with a chain of custody that began the day he first accessed the archive and continued through every step of verification and authentication. The legal scholars had been unanimous on one additional point: the non-disclosure did not necessarily constitute deliberate fraud as defined by council statute. That statute required proof of intent, which was difficult to establish for an action taken 53 years ago by an administrative office whose principles were no longer living. What it did constitute, clearly and without ambiguity, was a material omission that invalidated any vote taken without disclosure of the corrected information. Any vote. Including the one scheduled for tomorrow. He had sat with this knowledge for 8 months, from the moment the last authentication was confirmed to the day he boarded the transport for Conclave 7. 8 months of thinking through every scenario, every response, every counterargument, every way the Vethra's considerable legal team might attempt to manage or contain what he was about to bring into the room. He had prepared responses to all of them. He had prepared documentation supporting those responses. He had prepared, as a final layer, a sealed package containing the complete research file, already transmitted to an independent archival institution that operated on a dead man switch disclosure protocol, meaning that if Oren failed to confirm his safety within 48 hours of the session vote, the complete file would be transmitted automatically to every council member world's public information system. He was not naive about what he was doing. He spent the evening before the vote sitting at the desk in his delegation suite, reviewing his notes one final time, not because he needed to but because the act of reviewing was how he thought. He went through the arguments. He went through the counterarguments. He went through the charter language, Article 17, subsection 9, paragraph 4, until he could recite it from memory without effort. Then he made himself eat a meal, and drink water, and sleep for 6 hours, because he was a practical person and practical people understood that your mind worked better when your body had been maintained. In the morning, he put on his delegate credentials, picked up his bag, and went to the chamber. He had not told anyone what he was going to do. Not Petra, not the handful of other Earth diplomatic staff who had accompanied the delegation. Not the journalists who covered council sessions for the independent Galactic press, though he knew exactly which of them would know what to do with the information once it was in the public record. He had told no one because telling people was not how this worked. The moment the information became a rumor, it became manageable. The Vethra had 2 centuries of practice managing things that became rumors. What they had no practice managing was a verified fact, entered into the official session record, under a charter provision they had apparently forgotten existed. He found his seat in the observer tier. He placed his bag on his knee. He waited. The morning session opened with the procedural confirmation of yesterday's minutes and a brief update from the drafting committee on the final treaty language. The update was delivered by a Vethra administrative aide named Consultant Thresh, who was precise, efficient, and managed to make a legally transformative document sound like a budget review. The chamber floor was full. All 7 primary block delegations were at their positions. The observer tier was perhaps half occupied, most of the observers engaged with tablets or conducting quiet bilateral conversations. No one in the observer tier was expected to do anything today except watch. The session chair, a veteran Dorinian administrator named Chair Velas, called the session to order and began the procedural sequence for advancing to the vote. This involved a series of confirmatory statements from each delegation head, affirming their understanding of the treaty text as finalized. It was expected to take approximately 40 minutes. It took 37. Chair Velas had just begun the standard preamble for a recorded vote when Oren pressed the observer tier request button on his armrest console. The button existed because the console design was standardized across the chamber, including the observer tier. Whether the button was supposed to function in the observer tier was one of those interesting ambiguities that no one had ever had reason to test. It functioned. The session chair's display registered the request. Velas paused. He looked at his display. He looked up at the observer tier. His expression went through 3 stages in approximately 2 seconds, mild surprise, professional composure, and then something harder to read that might have been the specific wariness of someone who recognized that an unexpected variable had entered a carefully prepared sequence. The chair acknowledges a request from the observer tier, Velas said. His voice was entirely neutral. Representative of Earth, you have the floor for a point of procedure. Across the chamber floor, Oren saw heads turn. He saw the Vethra delegation's senior delegate Lear, who had been reviewing something on his personal device, look up. He saw the Cathali lead delegate lean forward slightly. He saw the Mira compact delegate go very still. Oren stood. He was aware of how he looked from the floor, a human, which was notable in itself in this chamber, standing in the observer tier, which was not where people stood when they spoke, in a room that had not heard an unexpected voice during a vote proceeding in living memory. He spoke clearly, at a volume calibrated for the chamber acoustics without the amplification system, which he activated half a second later. Chair Velas, I invoke Article 17, subsection 9, paragraph 4 of the Council's founding charter, and petition for emergency speaking status on the grounds that I possess independently verified documentary evidence of a material fact currently unknown to this chamber, directly relevant to the vote before us. Silence. Not the transitional silence between speakers, but the kind of silence that happens when something unexpected lands in a space that has been carefully managed toward a specific outcome. Oren had heard recordings of silences like this in historical sessions. He had never heard one live before. It was different live. It had weight. Chair Velas said, "The chair requires clarification on the nature of the petition. The charter provision requires only that the petition be accompanied by independently verified documentary evidence," Oren said. "I have that evidence and am prepared to submit it to the record immediately, with full authentication chain, for the Chamber's review before any vote proceeds." From the floor, Senior Delegate Lear rose to his feet. "Chair Velas, the provision referenced by the observer is a procedural relic of the founding period. The current session protocol does not recognize observer petitions during active vote proceedings." Oren had prepared for this. "Chair Velas, the charter provision in question predates and supersedes the session protocol, which is an administrative document. The protocol cannot override charter language. I would direct the chair to the Council's own legal precedent in the matter of founding document primacy, established in year 64, which affirmed that charter provisions remain actionable regardless of subsequent administrative protocol development." He had that citation memorized. He had also prepared a physical copy, which he removed from his bag and held up for the record. Chair Velas was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be meaningful. Whatever Velas was privately, he was a professional, and a professional in his position knew that dismissing a valid charter citation without examination was a different kind of problem than taking 30 minutes to review it. "The chair will call a 15-minute procedural recess to review the petition basis," Velas said. "All delegations will remain in the chamber." Oren sat back down. Petra, seated to his right, had not moved or spoken. She was staring at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. He looked at her briefly and said, quietly, "I should have told you earlier." "I'm sorry about that." She said, "You've been planning this the whole time." "Yes. Since before we came here." "Since before we came here." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it real? Whatever you have?" "Yes," he said. "It's real." Across the chamber floor, the Vethra delegation was in a tight, low-voiced conversation that was clearly not casual. Senior Delegate Lear had a particular quality of controlled stillness that Oren recognized from the session transcripts he had studied. It was the stillness of someone running calculations while performing calm. The 15-minute recess lasted 22 minutes. When Chair Velas returned to the session chair, his expression had resolved into something professional and careful. "The chair has reviewed the charter provision cited by the representative of Earth," he said. "The provision is valid and applicable. The petition is accepted. Representative Sable, you have the floor." Oren stood for the second time. He took the data core from his bag. He walked down from the observer tier to the floor. He set the data core on the submission terminal at the base of the session chair's dais and keyed in the authentication confirmation that would formally enter it into the permanent session record. This took 11 seconds. The terminal confirmed receipt and logged the chain of custody header into the public record in real time. Then he turned to face the chamber. He had written what he wanted to say and then deliberately discarded the written version, because he had decided that the arguments he had refined over 4 years were more credibly delivered without the distancing effect of a prepared text. What he was about to say was not a speech. It was a set of documented facts. He had reminded himself of that distinction every morning for 8 months. 53 years ago, he said, the Vethra Empire's Colonial Development Office commissioned a resource survey of the Varek Reach boundary system. That survey was completed, authenticated, and filed in the Colonial Development Office's public archive. It has been accessible there since its completion. It was never submitted to the Galactic Council. He paused for 2 seconds. Article 41 of the Council Charter required its submission. The Varek Reach meets every threshold criterion for mandatory disclosure: boundary system location, confirmed resource presence exceeding the disclosure threshold, and proximity to active development rights disputes. The survey was not submitted. It was not referenced in any of the 6 council sessions over the past 4 decades in which the Verek Reach's status was discussed. It was not included in the resource accounting that underlies the treaty this chamber is preparing to ratify today. He reached into his jacket and produced a printed summary document, one of 75 copies he had prepared, which Petra was now distributing to the delegations from the observer tier in a process he had briefed her on the night before without specifying the context. The survey's central finding is that the Verek Reach's 3rd and 4th planetary bodies contain a confirmed stellite or deposit that, at minimum, represents a 43% addition to the resource base this treaty is designed to govern. The authentication documentation for the survey's validity, my discovery process, and my research chain are included in the submitted data core. Independent verification was conducted by 3 separate geological assessment firms and 4 separate legal scholars, none of them Earth-based, none of them connected to any Vethra-affiliated institution. All verification documentation is included. He looked at the chamber. At the Cathali lead delegate, whose expression had gone very carefully blank. At the Mira Compact representative, who was reading the summary document with the focused attention of someone doing rapid arithmetic. At the Dorinian delegation, who were not looking at anyone. I am not making a claim of deliberate fraud, he said, and he was precise about this because he had been precise about it from the beginning. I do not have evidence of intent, and I am not alleging it. What I am establishing is that the resource base on which this treaty was negotiated is materially different from the resource base this chamber was given to understand. Any vote taken today ratifies a framework built on an incomplete record. Charter Article 41 requires that the complete record be disclosed before any binding vote on resource governance. The treaty vote cannot proceed until this chamber has had the opportunity to review the corrected information and reassess its implications. He stepped back from the center of the floor. That is all I have to say, he said. The documentation is in the record. I am available for questions. He walked back to the submission terminal, picked up his bag, and went back to his seat in the observer tier. The chamber was quiet for 7 seconds. He counted. Then Senior Delegate Lear of the Vethra Empire requested the floor. What Oren had anticipated about the Vethra response was that it would be controlled. What he had not fully prepared himself for was how controlled it would be. Senior Delegate Lear did not appear shaken. He did not appear angry. He appeared, if anything, mildly concerned, in the manner of a professional who has encountered a process complication that he is confident can be managed. This was either a performance of considerable skill or an indication that Lear had already decided on a path and was executing it, which were not mutually exclusive. Chair Velas, Lear began, the Vethra Empire takes seriously any procedural concern raised in good faith by any member or observer delegation. We welcome transparency and have nothing to hide regarding the Verek Reach. Oren noted the phrasing. Nothing to hide was not the same as, this is not accurate. It was a reframe. He had expected reframes. However, Lear continued, we would note that a 53-year-old survey document, accessed from an administrative archive by a junior observer delegation, cannot form the basis for suspending a treaty ratification process that has involved 11 years of multilateral negotiation and formal council review. The appropriate channel for concerns of this nature is the Treaty Review Committee, which has an established process for supplementary evidence submissions. He paused for effect. We would also note that the Earth delegation, as an observer tier member with less than a decade of council participation, may not be fully familiar with the procedural norms that govern evidence submission in active ratification sessions. It was delivered without malice. That was the craftsmanship of it. It was a suggestion of well-meaning inexperience, extended with almost paternal courtesy. In a different room, with a different audience, it might have worked. Chair Velas looked at Oren. Representative Sable, the chair offers you a right of response. Thank you, Chair Velas, Oren said. He remained seated, which he had calculated would be more effective than standing again. Senior Delegate Lear suggests the Treaty Review Committee is the appropriate channel. I would direct the Chamber's attention to Article 41, subsection 7, which specifies that disclosure obligations in active ratification sessions supersede committee referral timelines when the undisclosed information has direct bearing on the vote before the chamber. Legal review of this provision is included in the submitted documentation, with citations. He let that sit for a moment. As for the Earth delegation's familiarity with procedural norms, I would note that familiarity with norms is precisely what allowed the survey to go undisclosed for 53 years. The Earth delegation came to this chamber without assumptions about which facts were supposed to be known. That may have been useful. It was the closest he came to a pointed remark. He had decided that one was permissible. The chamber was doing something it had apparently not done in a considerable time, it was thinking. He could see it in the quality of attention across the floor. The Cathali lead delegate was reading the summary document with the focused care of someone who recognized numbers that changed things. The Mira Compact representative had put the document down and was speaking quietly to a delegation advisor. Two of the smaller independent bloc delegates were in a conversation he could not hear but could read well enough to understand that the resource allocation votes calculus had just shifted. Senior Delegate Lear requested the floor again. The Vethra Empire would like to propose a 48-hour recess to allow all delegations to review the submitted documentation and for the Treaty Review Committee to assess its bearing on the ratification timeline. Oren had also prepared for this. 48 hours was enough time for a considerable number of things to happen to a piece of evidence and its bearer, if someone were motivated and capable. He did not believe the Vethra would take any action that crude, but he was not willing to count on his belief. He pressed his armrest request button again. Chair Velas, the Earth delegation would support a short recess for documentation review, but would request that the submitted data core be confirmed in the session record as publicly sealed before any recess is called, with simultaneous disclosure to all member world public information systems, in accordance with the Charter's transparency provisions for material evidence in active ratification sessions. Another silence. Article 38, subsection 4, he added, because he had the citation ready. Chair Velas was quiet for a moment that was much shorter than his earlier pause. The chair will confirm the documentation as publicly sealed and initiate simultaneous member world disclosure. The chamber will recess for 24 hours. The gavel came down. Oren sat back in his chair. Petra had returned to her seat beside him. She did not say anything. Neither did he, for a long moment. When the observer tier began to empty, he gathered his things with his usual unhurried care. He looked at the chamber floor, at the center position, at the elevation he had measured once and never needed to measure again. It was still 12 centimeters. But the room felt different. The 24-hour recess did not produce what most people in the building initially expected, which was a managed settlement. The Vethra had extensive experience with managed settlements. The offer came through an intermediary to the Earth delegation suite at 0300 hours, framed as a preliminary discussion about Earth's development status and potential acceleration of its full floor access timeline, contingent on a clarifying statement from the Earth delegation regarding the scope and intent of the submitted documentation. Oren read the offer twice, filed it under the session record as an ex parte communication, which the Charter required him to do, and went back to sleep. At 0800, the independent Galactic press published the public record. By 0900, the survey documentation had been accessed by approximately 40,000 researchers, journalists, legal analysts, and diplomatic staff across the member worlds. By 1100, 3 independent verification teams had confirmed the geological findings. By 1300, the Cathali delegation had formally requested that the treaty ratification vote be suspended pending a comprehensive resource reassessment. The Dorinians followed 2 hours after that. The Mira Compact delegate issued a brief public statement saying that her delegation was reviewing all aspects of its treaty position in light of the new information. She did not mention the trade corridor offer. She did not need to. It was now in a context where mentioning it would require explaining why it had been made in the first place. Oren gave one interview, to a journalist from the independent Galactic press who had covered council sessions for 20 years and whose work he had read before leaving Earth. He answered her questions directly and without elaboration, because he had decided that direct and without elaboration was the mode that preserved the integrity of the factual record. He said he had found a document in a public archive. He said it described information that the charter required to be disclosed and had not been. He said the appropriate response to that situation was to disclose it through the proper charter mechanism, which he had done. The journalist asked him whether he was afraid. He said that fear was a reasonable response to uncertainty, and that he had spent 4 years reducing the uncertainty. She published the interview verbatim. The session reconvened at 1500. Chair Velas confirmed that the documentation had been publicly sealed and distributed as required. The Treaty Review Committee, which had apparently convened on an emergency basis that morning, presented a preliminary assessment that confirmed the survey's Article 41 applicability and recommended that the ratification vote be formally suspended pending a full resource reassessment. Senior Delegate Lear of the Vethra Empire requested the floor. Oren watched from the observer tier. Lear stood with the composure of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to execute it. The Vethra, to their institutional credit, were very good at executing decisions once made. The Vethra Empire acknowledges the documentation submitted by the Earth Observer Delegation, Lear said. We accept the Treaty Review Committee's preliminary assessment and will not contest the suspension of the ratification vote. We further commit to cooperating fully with the comprehensive resource reassessment process. He did not say the survey should have been disclosed. He did not say it was an error. He said the Vethra would cooperate fully with the process, which was the most that anyone was going to get right now, and Oren understood that. He had never expected an admission. Admissions were not what this was about. What it was about was the reassessment. He learned later, from the mathematician who ran the initial numbers, that the corrected resource base would require a fundamental revision of approximately 60% of the treaty's allocation formulas. The dependent worlds, whose negotiating positions had been based on a resource scarcity that was 43% more severe than the actual scarcity, would need to renegotiate from a position that was substantially more favorable than the one they had occupied for 11 years. The independent bloc had not yet determined what the implications were for their own positions, but their caucus had been meeting continuously since 0900. It would take years. Resource governance always took years. There would be further sessions, further negotiations, further careful management of a process that would not go smoothly because no process of this kind ever went smoothly. The Vethra Empire was not finished. It remained the most powerful single political entity in the Council, with the most sophisticated diplomatic apparatus, the deepest institutional connections, and 2 centuries of experience operating this system. One vote suspension did not change that. But something else had changed. Petra said it to him on the transport back from Conclave 7, in the quiet of the departure corridor before they boarded. The Cathali delegate stopped me in the concourse this morning, she said. She asked me to pass something on to you. She said, we have been looking at things we stopped looking at. We think there may be other surveys. Oren absorbed this. She also asked if Earth would be interested in establishing a joint research protocol with the Cathali delegation. Tell her yes, he said. He looked out the viewport at the red dwarf. It was still dim, still unnamed, still the same indifferent star it had been when he arrived. Nothing about it had changed. The room where the vote had almost happened, though. The room had changed. Not because of dramatics, not because of rhetoric, not because a small world had found a way to outmaneuver the most powerful empire in the galaxy through cleverness or courage or any particular quality that made for a compelling story. It had changed because a fact had been put into the record that could not be removed. That was, when he thought about it carefully, the only thing that had ever reliably changed anything. Not speeches. Not votes, when the votes were controlled. Not appeals to principle, when the principles were decorative. Facts, documented and verified and entered into the record where everyone could see them. He picked up his bag. He did not feel triumphant. He felt like someone who had finished one part of a long piece of work and could now see the next part clearly. The transport departed on schedule. Behind them, in the session chamber of Conclave 7, the session record remained sealed and public and permanent, carrying a survey 53 years overdue, and the name of the world that had finally brought it in.